The next qualitative research method we will go over in this class is depth interviews. Depth interviews are similar to focus groups because they go very much in depth about one topic or issue, but the main difference is that these interviews happen one-on-one, so no group interviews. Usually, it takes a lot of skill and training from an interviewer to do a good job in these depth interviews, and they often make use of non-directive techniques to uncover hidden motivations. So it's really a way to look deeply into what people think and feel, elicit more information from them, and understand their behavior better this way. A main technique that is used is probing questions. Probing questions are different from the typical clarifying questions we ask people on a daily basis. Clarifying questions are simple questions of fact. For example, what resources were used for the project, or what criteria did you use to evaluate a candidate? If I were to ask you, have you seen, let's say, the TV series Breaking Bad? And you say yes, well, that was just a simple clarifying question. If I ask you what you remember from Breaking Bad, you can answer the main top-of-mind aspects of the series that you remember. But if I were to ask you a follow-up question, specifically digging deeper, saying, oh, what else do you remember? Or is there anything else that comes to mind about Breaking Bad that you saw? Or can you tell me more about this? These are all probing questions. So probing questions require further thought. They dig deeper into an answer that a person has given initially. So basically stimulates people to think a little further and give a more complete answer. The main advantages of depth interviews is that, first of all, there's no group pressure like there is in focus groups. Sometimes with focus groups, there could be a group dynamic that makes people less likely to speak their mind. Now, with depth interviews, you only have that one-on-one interaction between the interviewer and the interviewee, so in that case, there's no group pressure. There's also more personal attention being given to the interviewee, and it's a great way to get to know underlying information, truly almost like a psychologist. Why do people feel and think a certain way? The good thing is also that it can be conducted everywhere. There's no special facility needed as with a focus group. You can literally have a depth interview in a park, on the subway, or in any calm facility. The main downsides of depth interviews are that there are no group dynamics. So this is kind of the flip side of the coin with those group peer pressure situations. Sometimes for certain topics you need group dynamics, so it's ideal to understand how a group interacts and behaves. So a focus group is sometimes more ideal. Also, you can cover very limited ground, so you don't go wide, you go very in depth about a certain issue. So usually you don't ask about all aspects of people's lives. You tend to go very in depth about one aspect of their life and then ask more in detail. They're usually more costly than a focus group because with depth interviews, as opposed to focus groups, you interview people one-on-one, so it takes more time of the researcher or of the interviewer to actually go through the whole sample. It also requires high skills of a very trained interviewer. Usually interviewers or moderators for focus groups, by the way, they have a background in psychology, sociology, sometimes marketing, and it does take high interpersonal skills. The key techniques that are used in depth interviews are laddering approach, hidden issue questioning, and symbolic analysis approach. Laddering boils down to the question why. Why do people do certain things? Why do they consume a certain product? So if you keep asking the question why, you can basically go from product attributes to consequences and benefits of these attributes, and then to personal values that are underlying this consumption behavior. Simple example would be, for example, a reusable water bottle. A simple product attribute or feature of this bottle is that it is reusable. So the fact that it is reusable is the key product feature here, or the attribute. This feature has certain consequences or benefits, namely no plastic waste. So if I were to ask you, why do you use a reusable water bottle? And you say, oh, that's because it just doesn't generate any plastic waste, then that would be a consequence or benefit of that feature. If I keep asking you why, if I ask, why do you care so much about plastic waste, or why do you care about avoiding plastic waste, then you could say, well, that's better for the environment. And here we are with personal values. It boils down to your personal value of why do you do certain things. Is it in line with what you stand for in life? Is it in line with your views and what you think is the right thing to do? Hidden issue questioning is a second technique often used in depth interviews. It's not so much about socially shared values, but more about personal sore spots or personally deeply felt concerns, dreams, and hopes. For example, hidden issue questioning could come in the form of asking people, what would you do if you won the lottery? And then depending on what people answer, it tells you a lot about what their truly hidden beliefs and dreams are. Or if you could ask people, please describe me like the best day in your life or the worst day in your life, like your worst nightmare. Again, depending on how people answer these extreme sorts of questions, what would be the best case scenario, what would be the worst nightmare, it brings to the surface any daydreams or hopes or anxieties that they may hold. Third, symbolic analysis approach. Symbolic analysis approach is a funny one. It basically asks people how they feel or think about something, but not asking them directly. It's asking them by contrasting that object with its opposite, or contrasting that behavior with the opposite of that behavior. For example, you could investigate non-usage or non-doing something. For example, if you want to know how people think about smoking, you could ask them, how do you feel about people who don't smoke? Or, for example, if you wonder how people think about using Apple products versus non-Apple products, you could ask them, how do you feel about people who don't have an iPhone? That would indirectly tell you something about how they feel about iPhone users. Or you could ask people to imagine the opposite version of a product. For example, well, how do you feel about alcohol-free beer? Or how do you feel about fat-free yogurt? And then lastly, another example would be to investigate perceptions regarding opposite types of products. Like if I were to ask you, what is the opposite of ice cream? Some people would answer the opposite of ice cream is hot soup, because they use the benchmark temperature as a way to create an opposite. So the first thing that comes to mind for them is ice cream is cold, so the opposite is soup, hot soup. Or some people would say the opposite of ice cream is a salad, because ice cream is more indulgent, a salad is considered more healthy, and so on. Or some people would say the opposite of ice cream is a brick, because one is soft and the other one is hard. So depending on how they look at ice cream or what the first feature of ice cream is that comes to mind, they will create a benchmark in their head and will create an opposite. So implicitly it tells you a lot about how they feel and think about ice cream, so what the first perception of ice cream is that comes to their mind. So this could sound a little bit far-fetched. This is the symbolic analysis approach and can sometimes still be very useful, because sometimes it's hard for people to express how they feel and think about something, but by allowing them to think about the opposite, it does actually indirectly give away some information. Another qualitative research method is protocol analysis. Protocol analysis is a way to gain insight into the decision-making process that people go through when they buy something. And this could be something very complex like buying a house, but also something very quick and trivial such as buying chewing gum. So with protocol analysis, you place people in a decision-making situation and you ask them to verbalize explicitly everything they consider, so every thought process they go through when making a decision. So all the steps they go through when trying to make a purchase decision for either very complex things such as a house or a trivial thing such as chewing gum. And then what you do is you compare across different individuals in your sample what these thinking processes or these thought processes look like. Another technique are projective techniques, and this is a collective of techniques that are commonly used in qualitative research. Again, they could sound a little far-fetched. A lot of them are borrowed from clinical psychology and social psychology and are pretty interesting. So projective techniques are meant to project participants into simulated situations. So you ask them to mentally transport themselves into a simulated situation, so an unreal situation, basically building on empathy and imagination. And this way, a lot of people divulge more information about themselves than under direct questioning. If you ask people things directly, often people can get defensive, people could get embarrassed, so this could create a lot of hurdles before they would actually disclose certain information about themselves. Projective techniques are literally a way around it. So one example would be the third-person technique. The third-person technique would be, for example, if instead of asking people, are you afraid of flying, you could ask them, what % of the population do you think is afraid of flying? Or do you think your neighbor is afraid of flying? Because people often answer in a socially desirable way. They will find it hard to admit that they might be afraid of flying. So to get more accurate results, or to get a more accurate idea of how many people are actually afraid of flying, you could ask them to give an estimate of how they think others feel about flying. So by projecting their thoughts and feelings onto a fictitious third person, you can actually, as a researcher, sometimes get more information from them. So this is called the third person technique. Another example of projective techniques would be the cartoon or balloon test, where people project their own thoughts and feelings onto a fictitious third person again, but by using a cartoon or text balloon. So you could present people with a cartoon where one person in the cartoon says something and the other one's text balloon is empty. So asking people to complete the conversation here and basically enter what they think this person in the cartoon says or would say as an answer to that question. This in itself, the creative answer that people write here, can tell you something about how they think and feel. Another example of a projective technique is the sentence or story completion tests. And there's different variations on the sentence or story completion test developed by different universities and researchers, but it usually goes something along these lines. When I came home from the gym last night, the kitchen was messy, my roommate was lying on the couch with a grin on his face. When I walked up to him, and then complete the story. So when you present respondents with a certain story and you abruptly end it, you ask people to complete that story based on how they complete the story. So basically the twist of events that happens according to them, that tells you something about where their thoughts are, where their fears, beliefs, and opinions are. So it does tell you something about a person depending on where they take that story. Another example is the thematic apperception test. Call them TAT, thematic apperception test. And this is a scenario where you present people with a picture and you ask them, what do these people in these pictures think and feel? What has happened before this event? What has led up to this event? What is in this picture on the left, Prince Harry thinking? What did he just say? What is Meghan Markle saying and thinking and doing? What is going to happen next? And so on. So the thematic apperception test actually stems from this researcher in the 30s called Murray. And this researcher had a grad student, and the grad student had a son. The son was about 4 or 5 years old, couldn't read yet, but would always browse through magazines and make up stories about the pictures he saw in those magazines. Of course, again, was totally made up by his own imagination. Now, this grad student wondered if the stories that a person makes up based on a picture would tell something about that person in a clinical psychology setting. So the grad student circled that information back to her professor, Murray, and they ended up using this type of test, the thematic apperception test, in a clinical setting to understand more about people's thoughts and their imagination. So basically what people think. Another example of a projective technique is the word association test, and this is something very straightforward. You basically ask people the first word that comes to mind when presented with another word. So if I ask you SESU, and in a second, in a heartbeat, you have to mention the first thing that comes to mind, or NFL, or cow, or love. Whatever the first thing is that pops up in your head tells you something about where your mind is going. Another qualitative method is ethnographic research, and ethnographic research is tremendously interesting and a very rich field of study. So ethnographic research means that you study behavior of people in a naturally occurring environment. So you basically join a group of people, live with them for extended periods of time, and learn from them as life unfolds in real time. So it's almost like live reality TV show meets research. It's often combined with multiple other research techniques such as interviews and focus groups, observation methods, and so on. One of the most famous ethnographic studies done in history is called Street Corner Society by William Foote White in the 40s. So what he did was he studied Italian gang members in the north of Boston. I don't know how familiar you are with Boston, but Boston historically had a lot of Italian immigrants. And in the 40s, there was a lot of mafia. So what William Foote White did was he infiltrated into that environment, lived with these people for extended periods of time to learn from them, learn their slang, learn the whole network, the ins and outs of that society. And that was written as a book called Street Corner Society, still incredibly relevant and interesting to read nowadays. Now the focus is more on ethnographic research, and ethnographic research is online ethnographic research. So basically, instead of studying real-world societies or communities, you study online communities such as Instagram communities, bloggers, YouTubers, and so on. Often these communities center around a certain hashtag or a certain location, a certain greater cause, some political causes, sometimes even a brand. There's a very loyal brand community built around GoPro or around Nike. Or some are just purely for fun, such as Dogs of Instagram and so on. But a lot of these communities really have a very rich dynamic, a lot of unwritten rules and sometimes written rules about how the community members interact with one another. So this is called ethnographic research. And then lastly, physiological measurement. I intentionally placed this one at the end of the list of qualitative research methods because it can also be used as a quantitative research method. So physiological measurement is a way to track or monitor a respondent's involuntary response to certain stimuli by the use of electrodes and other mechanical equipment. So one example would be the pupillometer, which measures the dilation of the pupils in people's eyes as they are presented with a certain stimulus. So typically when people are excited about something or they like something, their pupils dilate, so they get bigger. So this is an indicator, a physiological indication of liking a certain, let's say, ad or stimulus. An eye tracker is a device that tracks people's eyes as they look at an ad or any other stimulus. So it's really useful from a graphic design perspective to see where to put the slogan, where to put an image on an ad, where to put more information, basically built on these focal points of where people look. These higher concentrations are where people's eyes are more focused. A galvanometer is another mechanical device checking skin responses such as sweat, temperature, and so on in people's skin as they are presented with a certain stimulus. So all of these are upcoming and more objective measures of checking people's responses to an ad. But so like I said, physiological measurement is also commonly used in quantitative research, so I present it here at the end of the session about qualitative methods.